All right, I'll kick us off this morning. Thank you all for joining us for our fourth Newcomers series on REACH codes. Today we're going to be talking about REACH code options. We have a couple featured speakers we'll get to. So this is roughly what we're going to go over. We're going to do a quick review from our previous 3 sessions just to make sure everyone's on the same page. Then we'll talk about some options for REACH codes for new construction, some for building, existing buildings and related policy efforts, then our Q&A and discussion, and then we'll wrap it up. So that's our agenda for the day, or for the morning, fortunately. And so you may have noticed we are recording. The recordings will be available online as well as the slide decks, just like the previous ones are. Today, please, if you have clarifications while people are talking, like something that you really need to understand in order to understand the point, please go ahead and just raise your hand to ask for the clarification. And if it's a quick question, we'll address that as we go through. But otherwise, put comments, more involved questions in the chat. We'll bring those up at the natural breaks. And at the end, we do have time set aside for a more in-depth discussion and Q&A. So just to review again, this webinar series is intended for local government staff to provide some background and technical information for folks who are new to REACH codes. And we're not trying to advocate for a particular code or discuss like what you need to do to get one adopted or how the technical calculations happen. Or how to implement it, but just like trying to give you a good starting place and a good foundation in terms of what REACH codes are and how they work. Do want to do a quick poll for who's in the room. So I'm going to put, well, I've already got some responses. I'm going to put a link in the chat, which I think I put in before, but I'm not sure how this one works. So I'll do it again. There we go. Please take a second and fill that out. Just let us know what you best represent: local government, regional, state government, building professionals, consultants, etc. And also the other question is where you are from, what part of California or outside the Bay Area. So just going to give folks a second to do that. Just 2 questions, and it's helpful for us to know what people's backgrounds are and where they're coming from. So that we can make sure that this all fits and works for everyone. Just give another second here. If you haven't had a chance to fill out the poll, the link is in the chat, just to give us a sense of who's in the room, so we all know who we're talking with. And Raphael, looks like you have a question. I need to come off of mute. Oop, nope, no question. All right, got it. All right, so let's just take a quick look here. It looks like we are more than half local government staff, followed by other. And then we've got some consultants, some utility and CCA reps, some regional and state government, and some architects and building professionals. So good mix of people, but again, the focus today is really for local government, so that's good that that's the majority. And as to where people are from, we've got folks from the Bay Area and Southern California, but also from Central Coast, the Sierras, and other parts of Northern California. So that's great. We've covered the state from the south to the north, and in the middle as well. So excellent. Thank you guys. Thanks for responding to that. That's really helpful for us. So that quick review, session 1 all the way back in January, we talked about what is a REACH code, and we are generally meaning it's an amendment to the California Energy Code, Title 24, Part 6, though I'll get to the exception about that in a minute. And for this type of REACH code, the requirements are it has to be at least as restrictive as the energy code. It has to be cost effective. There are required findings that the REACH code is needed for local climatic, geological, topographic, or environmental reasons. That's for any amendment to the building code. An amendment to the energy code has to be approved by the California Energy Commission and filed with the Building Standards Commission. And it can't require equipment that exceeds the federal standards, which is federal preemption. So it can't require a super high efficient water heater, although if someone wanted to use one as an option, they could do that, but it can't be required. And there are other policy tools that are available to do many of the things that REACH codes do. Those have different legal bases and requirements, and sometimes they're informally also called REACH codes, which can be a little confusing sometimes. And we're going to get into some of that today, delving into some of those different options for you. Session 2 focused on the REACH code process. We talked about these first 3 steps, which is kind of where people are at this point in the year, generally speaking. Identifying the goals and options, looking at the technical information and analyses, and developing a proposed REACH code. And those are all informing each other and informed by the local stakeholder input and public process. After that, once you have a proposed REACH code, then there's a formal public process and adoption, followed by the state agency review and approval, and actually the implementation. And we will talk about the implementation at our next REACH code webinar in September. And we do have that break between now and then because we want, we're trying to sort of follow along to when people are thinking about these things. And hopefully by September, people will be really thinking about implementation. Session 3, our last one, really delved into cost effectiveness and cost effectiveness studies. And there's a lot of information here, but the very high level key points that something is cost effective when the value of the benefits exceeds the costs. And you can calculate that in a number of different ways and different bases. It can be cost effective on an on-bill basis where people who implement the measure will see savings on their bill that are sufficient to pay for the cost, or a time-dependent valuation basis, which is looking more at society as a whole will see the savings that exceed the cost, but it may not have the savings on the bill for the individual. You can use cost effectiveness studies to assess policy impacts as well as to document legal compliance. So there's different ways to use these. And they can mean different things to different stakeholders. We heard from one of our city folks last time about how, you know, developers, building owners, tenants, and society all see cost effectiveness in different ways, and different parts of the process are different for them. And cost effectiveness can also be used to help balance some of the different interests and to help negotiate, to bring some facts and some clarity when you've got a lot of different interests who are working on this. Many of the studies are available at localenergycodes.com and through the Cost Effectiveness Explorer. And yes, it is complicated, but help is available. You are not alone. So that's where we left off with the cost effectiveness. And today we're talking about we're going to talk about some options. So this table summarizes legal options that local governments have to address new and existing building energy use and GHG emissions. So as you can see, REACH codes are one of the tools here, but there are other options as well. So we're going to dive into some of these things, which are sometimes people refer to all of these things as REACH codes. So we'll try to be really clear as we go through. And I wanted to mention also that for some of these, such as reach codes, there are different variations as well as these options. So this table can be expanded in different dimensions as well. So most of our webinar today is going to be presented by a couple of featured speakers. We're so lucky to have them. From the Building Decarbonization Coalition, we have Lawrence Garber and Amy Ryder. So Lawrence is going to be talking first about the options for new construction, focusing on reach codes and natural gas moratoriums. And then Amy is going to provide some information about options for existing buildings. So with that, I'll hand it over to Lawrence.
Thank you, Karen. Really appreciate it. Thanks for providing that overview, introduction, and all the work that has gone before this webinar, in sessions 1, 2, and 3 to sort of set up this conversation for today. So really appreciate that, and want to say hello and good morning to all of you joining. As Karen mentioned, my name is Lawrence Garber. I use he, him pronouns. I'm with the Building Decarbonization Coalition. And thinking about the table that Karen just mentioned, I want you to imagine we're sort of, as she mentioned, kind of expanding and sort of complicating, if you will, that table that was just up on the screen, and sort of, walking through some of the nuances there. So I'll be covering the options that local governments have at their disposal, specifically for new construction to reach beyond the statewide code and or to use this local government's jurisdictional authority. So we'll talk about the various mechanisms and requirements for each approach, some different considerations that we've seen local governments take in comparing the various approaches, and then I'll close with some examples. Next slide, Karen. Great. So, as we've discussed in previous webinars, and as Karen mentioned, local governments in California have the authority to set requirements in addition to the requirements of the state's building codes. And so I'm going to kick us off to kind of when we talk about the overall building code, for the purposes of our conversation today, we're referring to the 2 sections of the state building code that can serve as the basis for reach codes. And that is Part 6 of the building code, the energy code, and Part 11, Cal Green, or also known as the green building code. So, oftentimes the vocab around those gets a little bit confusing, but wanted to start off with sort of the basis for the state code. And depending on the goals of the local government, either code can be used as a basis for a reach code, or either code can be sort of reached beyond. And so the other policy mechanism that's often lumped together under the term reach code, if you could click next, Karen, thank you, is a municipal ordinance, or otherwise referred to as a natural gas moratorium. And so this pathway uses the jurisdiction's police power, that is the power that it exercises to protect and preserve the health and safety within the jurisdiction. So starting here at this kind of high level, so these are the sort of the 2 parts of the state code, and the sort of third option, which is the local government's own jurisdictional authority. And so we'll get into the details about some considerations for each of these approaches in the next slides. So beginning with the California code structure, and starting a couple decades back from a historical perspective, the different parts of the code were created at different times to address different crises. So the energy code on the left was first adopted in 1978 in response to the energy crisis of the early 1970s to support California's long-term strategy to meet energy demand. So the energy code has been around the block for a couple decades. It governs energy efficiency, for example, doors, windows, insulation, lighting, as well as solar PV and battery storage requirements. In addition to the various requirements, they vary between residential and commercial, as well as there's variation across the climate zone in which they're implemented. And I wanted to note just briefly here regarding the 2022 update. There's some notable updates to the 2022 code that will affect local governments kind of thinking in terms of what type and what they include in a REACH code, or what they could include for 2022. And those are the fact that the 2022 code now encourages electric heat pump technologies in some, and it varies by climate zone, varies by building type, but overall that's kind of the gist. The 2022 code also establishes electric readiness requirements, so that will be statewide for new construction in 2022. It expands solar PV system and battery storage standards, and it also serves to strengthen ventilation standards to improve indoor air quality. So that's the kind of the gist of the energy code and a brief highlight of the 2022 updates. CalGreen, on the other hand, is again, moving back to the historical perspective, is newer. In 2007, the California Building Standards Commission was directed to develop green building standards in an effort to meet the goals of AB 32, which is the famous Global Warming Solutions Act. So AB 32's first scoping plan, when that was first being developed, identified buildings as the second largest source of California's greenhouse gas emissions. And so the Green Building Code was created in response to that law, and it contains both voluntary and mandatory measures that include the measures that are sort of summarized here on the screen: indoor air quality, water efficiency, planning and design, some additional components of energy efficiency, and material conservation. So one of the things that both of these parts of Title 24 have in common are they are updated triannually every 3 years. And importantly, REACH codes that local jurisdictions adopt are in a sense tied to either of these codes. So they must be readopted every 3 years as part of the process to be tied to the most recent version of the code. And jurisdictions have the authority to choose which requirements under Part 6 or Part 11 that they are choosing to make more stringent, as long as they satisfy the legal requirements for Part 6 and the legal requirements for Part 11, which are a little bit different for each, and we've gone through that in some of the previous webinars. So next slide. So in addition to addressing different energy efficiency or design characteristics for new construction, as I mentioned, REACH codes, so what local governments choose to adopt, can also address different types of buildings within a jurisdiction, and they also have the authority, or let's see, so I've got it summarized here. So if you have the authority to have your REACH code apply, as I said, to different building types. Next slide. In addition, local governments have the authority to exempt specific building types or equipment types. For example, attached accessory dwelling units can be exempt from the requirements in your ordinance, or, for example, industrial equipment could be exempt. And there's various other exemptions that local governments have decided to include in their ordinances. So it's not a full list of examples here, but just some samples. Next slide. So another table for us. What I want to walk through here are the various new construction electrification approaches that local governments have taken over the last several years. And there's a couple different ways you could sort of categorize, if you will, this information. But what we're offering here is the overall three basic approaches that local governments have taken, and that is the natural gas moratorium or municipal ordinance in green, that column there. The blue column, which is an all-electric ordinance that uses either the Energy Code or so either the Energy Code Part 6 or Cal Green Part 11 to require electrification. And then thirdly, there's a route which we referred to as an electric preferred ordinance, which can also be tied to either either Part 6 or Part 11. And so, as I mentioned, local governments have the authority to pass these types of policies, and they have that authority because electrification ordinances are not designed to impose greater efficiency standards than state law, and thus shouldn't trigger federal preemption. So, starting with the green column, I'll kind of give a high-level overview, and then we'll sort of go deeper into some of the considerations. But note that at the beginning, as I sort of discussed at the top of today, is that natural gas moratoriums are not tied to the state code at all, and instead use the jurisdiction's police powers, the power to protect and preserve health and safety. What they do is they may either restrict the materials used in new construction to require all electric buildings, or the language might be that they prohibit the installation of gas infrastructure. And as I said, I'll get into sort of some considerations around that. The middle option, the all-electric ordinance, it can either be tied to Part 6 or Part 11 of Cal Green. And if it's tied to Part 6, the jurisdiction must follow the legal requirements that we discussed. And as the name suggests, all electric ordinances require no new gas appliances, or in some examples, jurisdictions have called out that no new gas space and or water heating be allowed. And the final option is, as I mentioned, referred to as an electric preferred ordinance. And what this ordinance does is it sets up a requirement that says that the building, if it's built, it essentially offers two routes. If the building is built all electric, then the requirement is that that all electric building must meet code standards. The additional requirement that's placed upon a mixed fuel building is that it must exceed code by a given compliance margin, and that's expressed as a percentage, comparing the proposed design, whatever the proposed design may be, to the standard code compliant design. And a quick takeaway that I'll note here, in terms of if you were a jurisdiction going just the all electric route, that it may make sense to tie your ordinance to Part 11 of Title 24. On the other hand, if any part of your designed ordinance does fall under energy conservation, if it has energy conservation components, for example, if there's an additional requirement for PV for additions and alterations, any energy efficiency component must go through Part 6. And wondering if Misty or Amy, if there's any clarification there around that piece, because I want to make sure that aspect is clear. And so just, yeah, I wanted to pause there to see if there were any clarifications there.
Yeah, I'll happily just chime in very briefly. For those of you who have gone through any kind of reach code before, I just want to point out that this is different, excuse me, and that in the past we have tied electrification focused all electric and electric preferred ordinances exclusively to Part 6 and used Part 11 for other kinds of reach codes. And it seems that given the changes in the 2022 code, that there's a movement away from that and really using the Cal Green construct to build off of, to not as a workaround to the CEC, but actually to clarify the distinction between the roles of the Energy Commission and the Building Standards Commission. So just want to point this out, like for those that might be on the call that are renewing something that was approved under Part 6, it is possible that that same code under the 2022 code cycle might need to go under Part 11. So that's the only distinction I would make, and Misty, feel free to add on.
I would just add that in addition to clarifying the different roles of the different agencies, it also serves to clarify the intent of the policy very specifically. If it's an energy conservation or energy efficiency policy, Part 6, if it's an electrification or a policy that is focused on the infrastructure, then it goes through a different part of the building code, like Part 11. Yeah, it's evolving for us all. So, thank you, Lauren.
Great. Yeah, well, then thank you, Amy and Misty, for providing that additional clarity, as this is, as we've mentioned, this is kind of, on the frontier of policy development. So we're all kind of learning about, this as we go. So appreciate that. I think, Karen, we can move on to the next slide. Awesome. So what I wanted to do in the next 3 slides is go a little bit deeper on each approach and highlight some of the considerations that might go into your decision-making process. And this is, not intended to be kind of an all-inclusive step-by-step guide. It's more kind of the universe of things that might be in your decision-making checklist or agenda. Just wanted to highlight some of the pieces here. So starting with the new construction, so starting with the municipal ordinance route, again, this is not tied to the state code, but uses the jurisdictional authority's police powers to prohibit new gas hookups or piping. Some of the considerations here is it has been noted and reported by different jurisdictions that this may be the hardest political route, given the sort of the name of, it's often referred to as a natural gas ban. Doesn't have to be the hardest politically, but that's been observed. Another consideration here is that because the municipal ordinance is not tied to the every 3-year update of the statewide building code, it's the longest lasting in that it does not have to be renewed every 3 years. Additionally, from a legal perspective, a cost effectiveness study isn't technically required, but as Karen alluded to, I believe in the introduction, cost effectiveness studies are an incredibly powerful tool for decision making. So while it may not be, like I said, it may not be legally required, it's certainly very powerful to have, cost effectiveness information at hand when making policy. And as we've mentioned, this approach does not require CEC approval, as it doesn't modify Title 24 Part 6, the Energy Code. And lastly, this approach, because it doesn't have to go through the CEC, may be immediately enforceable. And I put some examples of jurisdictions that have gone this route up here on the screen for your reference. There are numerous resources that will be attached to the end of this presentation that are links to the staff reports and the ordinances themselves for follow-up, but wanted to include some example jurisdictions here. Next slide. All right, moving along the color wheel from green to blue, we've got the all electric approach. And so this approach is classically referred, well, it is tied to the state code. And as we mentioned, it can be either tied to Part 11 or Part 6. If a jurisdiction chooses to go to just focus on an electrification ordinance, then the recommended route is to go through Part 11. If the jurisdiction chooses to add additional measures that affect energy efficiency or energy conservation, those measures need to be tied to Part 6. So this approach, as we've talked about, and as the name suggests, requires electrification of new construction. Some considerations are that compared to sort of the natural gas moratorium, it has been seen to be easier to adopt politically. It is tied to the, in both the case of both Part 11 and Part 6, if the REACH code were to be tied to either of those state codes, it would need to be renewed every 3 years. And if it is tied to Part 6, the energy code, then in order to adopt this approach, the ordinance would be subject to legal requirements for energy REACH codes that we've discussed, the three legal requirements there, that they're cost effective, that there's no federal preemption, and that the codes require more stringent standards than the state code. A sample, I've included here a sample of jurisdictions that have gone this approach. There are more than that, but wanted to offer some examples there. And next slide. So the final new construction approach that we'll talk about today is an electric preferred ordinance. And this type of approach for electrification sets up sort of a choice for developers. It says, as I mentioned, that if a development is built and designed to be all electric, then the requirement of this ordinance is that the all electric design must meet the statewide standard, so your traditional route. If the proposed design goes the mixed fuel route, then there are additional compliance standards that go above and beyond the state code expressed, as I mentioned, as a percentage, a compliance margin above the standard compliant design. And so some of the considerations around this path are that given the sort of extra step around that compliance decision, they've been perceived to be harder to enforce. It's a little bit more of a complicated step. Additionally, given that under the assumption that not every building in the jurisdiction is required to be all electric, then the result would be that there may be lower greenhouse gas savings from this approach if indeed buildings in that jurisdiction were constructed with a mixed fuel design. As I mentioned, this approach is subject to being renewed every 3 years. And I'll just note here that, as I mentioned in some of the previous slides, the 2022 code for certain climate zones and for certain building types already has a heat pump baseline, which will serve at the state level to it's not an all electric requirement, but the state is essentially building in a little bit of an electric preference in the base code that is applies to all buildings across the state. And finally, I included some examples here. Again, just a sample of jurisdictions that have gone this approach for your reference. And next slide. So to show to y'all the kind of the table in pie chart form, we all love pie. I don't know what type of pie this would be. I don't know what type of pie is like orange, green, and blue. Not the most appetizing, but the point being here that most jurisdictions over the past several years, 62% around, have decided to go the all electric ordinance approach. Around 20% have done the electric preferred approach, and around 15% have done the natural gas moratorium. So just wanted to offer this this graph here, and the takeaway being that most cities have opted to use the all electric reach code. Next slide. And so to kind of bring it back to what we were talking about, or what I was discussing previously, is that the codes themselves and sort of what is included in the code can sort of serve as a basis for let's say the menu of options that are available to local jurisdictions. So you have the legal authority to reach beyond the state code kind of via these different areas. And with the energy code, I'll say that again, if you're thinking about pairing electrification with any sort of energy efficiency measure, those would fall under Part 6, the energy code, versus the green building code. That's where, for example, if you wanted to choose to add additional electric vehicle requirements, that would fall under Part 11. And the way that Part 11 is structured is there are some mandatory measures in Part 11 and some voluntary tiers. And the tiers themselves, so there's Tier 1 and Tier 2, Tier 2 being a little bit more stringent. So if you took an example for electric vehicle charging, Tier 1 has a certain percentage, I can't remember the number, whereas Tier 2 requires an increased percentage in electric vehicle charging infrastructure. So the Cal Green tiers can be passed as an ordinance also to either pair with an electrification ordinance or not. So the point here being that all of these options can be layered on if a local government chooses to add them. Next slide. Okay, so we've shown you several matrices. We've broken down different policy routes. We've given some caveats. We've given some legal requirements. So it's what I wanted to close with before we kick it over to Amy to talk about existing buildings is what this has looked like in practice to sort of describe the process, and chose San Jose here as one example, but I think really a takeaway example, given that 56 jurisdictions have done this, that each, so there are 56 different stories and at least 56 different kind of ways that this has transpired. So I wanted to highlight San Jose, and so first, starting on the left-hand side here, the timeline was, in September of 2019, San Jose decided that they wanted to take some action. At the time, they had been developing their various climate action plans, and they decided they wanted to adopt something regarding buildings. And so they did. They decided to adopt an electric preferred ordinance that was tied to Part 6, the energy code. And in addition to the electric preferred route, they also passed some additional electric vehicle requirements, which is tied to Part 11, the CalGreen. And then a month later, they decided to supplement that REACH code ordinance with the natural gas moratorium approach that prohibited natural gas infrastructure in some specific building types. So you see that represented on the screen. Excuse me. And then fast forward a year later, after enacting the natural gas moratorium, they realized they wanted to go further. More information had come to light, and so they updated their natural gas moratorium to cover more building types. And so I walked through this, this very high level. Obviously, there's lots of detail that went into each of these decisions, and lots of great information available on the City of San Jose's website. But I say all this to say that jurisdictions have the authority and the options to go lots of different routes. It's not necessarily optimal to be changing it up from the consistency perspective, but just wanted to highlight here that jurisdictions do have the authority to layer different options, and then in time, if in a few years, to go back and kind of readjust their approach. And so I believe with that, I will pause and see if there's any questions in the chat. It looks like there's been some chat going on that I haven't seen, so I'll pause here, Karen.
Yeah, so Lawrence, there's a couple questions related to the San Jose ordinance in particular. So I'd like to just start with those. Folks are wondering if there are exceptions for certain building types, such as restaurants or labs or affordable housing. Is that something that you know, or you want to refer people to the website?
Definitely refer to the website. And I actually, as I was putting this together, was obviously reviewing some of their requirements. So I just put into the chat a graphic that summarizes, and this I just pulled from San Jose's website, this table. And so some of the exceptions it looks like they do have in San Jose are for hospitals and for facilities with a distributed energy resource. Yeah, thank you for screen sharing that. That's perfect. And it looks like limited exemptions allowed by request on or before December 31st, 2022 for commercial cooking equipment located in food service establishments and processed loads in manufacturing and industrial facilities.
Yeah. And then I'm seeing questions here, and Misty and Amy have been both responding in the chat, but it seems like there's a little more clarification desired about Part 11 and Part 6 and all electric requirements. So starting with the most recent question, asking, can a REACH code have an all electric requirement and go through Part 11, but not Part 6? And Amy, Misty, do you want to, since you've been talking about that in the chat?
So maybe some history would help, because it is a little bit of an evolving challenge. Part 11 interacts with Part 6, so it gets complicated quickly in certain areas, because the way CalGreen was designed was that it has intentionally, because it has elements that are optional, it is a little bit of like the experimentation zone. And so there have been historically things that are energy code specific that were introduced in CalGreen as optional and then have transferred over the course of time. And so some of the things, for example, that are merging over from Part 11 to Part 6 in this upcoming code cycle are photovoltaics. So depending on your building type, you might be building off of Part 6 or Part 11. The point, however, that I would like to underline is that whenever you're increasing energy efficiency or increasing generation requirements, the process is exactly the same, regardless of how you stack that in the code. And it falls under what was just described as the Part 6 approach. So needing to have cost effectiveness and go through the CEC approval process. So hopefully that clarifies. It is a little muddy because it does continue to evolve.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. And Misty, I want to ask if you want to add anything to that. And also there was a question about clarifying the differences in the adoption process between a REACH code that's tied to Part 11 versus one that's tied to Part 6. So Misty, if you want to do that and add anything else.
Sure. I'm not going to add anything to Amy's explanation. I think I'll just muddy the waters. That was very clear, I thought. But as far as the adoption process, Part 6 is a little bit different than either the municipal code amendment or Part 11. As far as the jurisdiction role, you still have to go through all of the beginning processes. You have to do outreach, talk to all your stakeholders, go through your council process. But once you've adopted, once council or the Board of Supervisors has adopted, if the ordinance amends Part 6, you have to then submit a package to the CEC for their review and approval. Now, the CEC's review and approval is simply an administrative review, ensuring that the local government has followed all the required processes and documented everything that needs to be documented. The determination of whether something is cost effective is entirely the local government's jurisdiction. And so the only difference is that if you amend Part 6, you must go through the CEC process. Now, you have to plan probably 2 to 3 months on average for that process. The CEC has to review the package, it goes through their legal review, and then it has to be approved at a business meeting, which typically are held once a month. And so it takes a little bit of time to go through that process. So just make sure that you plan 2 or 3 months for that to get completed. If you amend Part 11, well, actually, let me finish. After CEC approval, then you file that ordinance with the Building Standards Commission. Building Standards Commission will acknowledge receipt. They simply review the paperwork. That's it. Then you are enforceable and effective. If you amend Part 11, you only have to file with the Building Standards Commission. You do not have to file with the CEC. Hopefully that clarified.
Yeah. And just building on that, I did answer this in the chat, but just wanted to mention it. We had a question whether that a Cal Green Tier 1 or Tier 2 adoption would require CEC approval and a cost effectiveness study. And yes, that is the case. It's sometimes confusing because the Cal Green Tier 1 and Tier 2 are in Cal Green, but they are increasing energy savings and energy conservation. So that is why you still have to go through the CEC approval and cost effectiveness requirement. So I think that covers the questions. Everything's either been answered in the chat. So are there any other questions that folks have on what Lawrence has discussed here for new construction before we move on to existing construction? All right, excellent. All right, so Amy, turn it over to you then.
Thanks so much. Dude, yeah, thank you. Great job explaining what's a really complicated process, and there's lots of options, and that we're really only just focusing, or that presentation really just focused on electrification opportunities, and there's so many more ways to build on it. I just want to put out, feel free to ask, because it's how you word the actual code language changes the procedure sometimes. Most of the time not, but just occasionally it's always acceptable to ask questions. So little things are funny when you're dealing with code changes. So thank you for walking us through that, everyone. And now we get to turn to the even more fuzzy area. Hopefully we can have some fun discussing this as well. So the portion of my presentation, again, I'm Amy Ryder with the Building Decarbonization Coalition, and I get to talk about existing building options. And this is a both dynamic and evolving area of local government authority, but also something that other types of agencies are looking at for their own authority right now. So we'll walk through the local government options, but then some of the other things that are happening both at the regional and state level as well. And I'll spend a little bit of time talking about waivers and exemptions, kind of the history of these different options as well. So we'll go ahead and get started in doing so. So there is so far only one type of existing building ordinance that focuses on electrification that's been adopted in the state. So I just want to spend a couple minutes on what that is and how it works. And then we're going to talk about some of the broader opportunities that are emerging that people are discussing and developing that perhaps are not as clear cut yet. So residential retrofits or electrofits, as some are calling them, are one option that has effectively taken shape through the same process of a traditional Part 6 based reach code to focus on when a retrofit is actually occurring in the low rise, single family or very few building types, really. So single family or 1 to 2 unit low rise multifamily units can apply for this. And what it looks like is a point-based menu that would give you options for during a retrofit process to upgrade energy efficiency. And that is merged with electrification options, and each of the different options on the menu, which are defined by the jurisdiction up to a point, are given point values, and that jurisdiction that adopts these then can decide how many points are required in order to make up the minimum requirement for that retrofit project. And so what this does is promotes electrification without requiring it, so that you're not running into that preemption issue. Anyone who's interested in learning more about this, I encourage you to check out this really handy tool that actually helps you define what this looks like and will draft code language for you. And this is included also at the end of the presentation, but the energy cost, the cost effectiveness explorer, I always mess up the name, my apologies. It's a really great tool for helping to figure that out. Also, I will point out that both the city of Piedmont and the city of Encinitas have passed ordinances like this. So it's both the Bay Area and Southern California that have working examples of this particular approach. Just because we were talking about it, I will mention that these are both because they change energy efficiency, they have to be approved by the Energy Commission. So these are effectively have to go through that same process that was being described earlier. Now for the more fun stuff, or at least the less tested. Before I get to that, let's just talk through the reality of existing buildings. There's a reason that not many jurisdictions have tackled this yet. Lots of you, I'm sure, and lots of others are thinking through this. No, you can go to the next slide. Because there are a number of challenges. There are many tricky things when you're talking about an existing building, even though that's most of the challenge that we're faced with when we're trying to enact our climate action plans. Existing buildings are certainly a far greater percentage of the building stock. but that doesn't make them easier. So new construction is relatively straightforward. And then we get into these other challenges when we move beyond that. So I just want to point out that we have equity in general is just something that can no longer be ignored, shall we say, and making sure that folks of all creeds and income levels need to be thought carefully of and considered and brought into the process of developing these codes, but also protected from whatever the consequences of them might be. So there are some interesting existing building studies out there that look at what some potential guardrails might look like for these kinds of ordinances, and we can talk through some of those specifics if you like. There's also just the broad challenge of once you have the building built, a lot of people don't bother to get permits. And so avoiding permits for certain types of upgrades is really common. And with low compliance, enforcement can be really tricky when you're talking about single appliance changeouts. So what does that look like, and what trigger points and leverage does a local government really have? They can be more political, mostly because of equity and vulnerable community challenges, but also you start to look at people's homes, and anybody who's worked on a new construction ordinance has probably heard, no matter how many times you say it, this is just for new construction. Everyone wants to protect what they have. It is a really common human reaction, and people will jump immediately to, are you going to take my stove away? This is a conversation I have almost every day. So that begets more politicizing. And then we have the regional inconsistency. The lovely thing about REACH codes is that local governments can make it their own and make it work for them and their community. And each of you have that ability to make them unique. And that can also add some real challenges for those trying to design, build, and maintain the building stock in your communities. If it's unclear who requires what, or if there's inconsistency. So we're actually seeing a lot this code cycle of whole regions trying to do exactly the same thing to mitigate that challenge. And I just want to point out that certainly there's some really great work that's happening in the existing building space right now, doing full assessments of building stock. Again, you can go to the Cost Effectiveness Explorer and actually find out some information about your own building stock and how old each of the, like a breakdown of age of the buildings in your region, at least the residential ones, can be found on that website. So to help you start to understand kind of the extent of the challenge that you're faced with. So let's get into more specifics, please. Next slide. All right. So as local governments, I just want to talk through what trigger points you realistically have and how that matches up with potential ordinance language that you could adopt. This is really where the rubber meets the road. We've got, as we discussed, I'll just kind of walk you through this chart briefly. As we discussed, REACH codes are and continue to be one opportunity that local governments have. We also have seen a rise of conversations around emission limits on appliances themselves. So rather than the energy efficiency qualification of an appliance, how much does it contribute to air quality? And so this is an authority that actually exists through the air quality management agencies, through the California Air Resources Board under the auspices of the Clean Air Act. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as well. There's the potential to require appliance replacement at some point, and what that might look like. And then we'll get into, those are the three areas. I'll just say the top three on this chart are definitely where people are spending a lot of time right now in the development process of trying to understand what legal mechanisms might work best to enact these opportunities. And then the last two, the community scale phase out and setting a building emission standard, are things that take a little bit more planning and time, and yet are also legal possibilities. So the community scale phase out is sometimes referred to as regional electrification or branch trimming, for example. So this is really talking about turning off the gas system to specific locations and phasing out either over the course of time or by a particular date. And then we have building emission standards as well, which, similar to a building performance standard, which tracks energy efficiency over the course of time, sets an emissions limit over the course of time as well. And instead of being just energy related, it is how much typically greenhouse gas emissions we're looking at. So that is one opportunity that we can talk through. Now, each of these, of course, has different times at which you can actually make that effectively happen. And I've just laid them out here. You're probably all familiar with these, but just so you could say, so upon replacement, which assumes a one-to-one change out and a permit, if there is in fact a local government opportunity to make it happen, but replacements happen every day. And so many of these opportunities actually have these particular approaches have the opportunity upon replacement to have an impact. Extending out, we've got the during retrofit, which extensive retrofits and projects tend to be more likely to get a building permit, and so perhaps have slightly higher level of compliance. And there's opportunities here as well. And doesn't work for a neighborhood scale, but it does work for all of the other approaches. And then, of course, we have the time of sale, which is a very specific and politically charged, but very specific trigger that has some potential promise as well in this arena. And there are a few models around the state that have proven to be useful to use a time of sale for energy efficiency. No one has yet required that for electrification. Or for any of the other things you might be interested in that I know of, solar or electric vehicles and things of that nature. Those are our considerations, however. And then, of course, the date certain, which is to set a date in the future and to say by such and such date, you must meet whatever that requirement is. Some of these are stackable so that upon replacement, you could have a phase-in date certain, same with time of sale, that by such and such a date over time, you kind of phase in these requirements. So as I said, I think the jury is still out as to what will rise to be the most popular of these approaches, and frankly suspect that a combination will likely be the what we see forthcoming in this code cycle. There are active examples of both the REACH codes, as we've discussed, and building emission standards are increasingly popular both in California and elsewhere. So this is not new, but again, it starts with tracking where buildings are and then tracking them over the course of time. So that it is something that just takes time to implement. I will say that building emission standards are most common for commercial buildings for lots of good reasons, but that is where we're seeing the models develop right now. And then the appliance replacement piece is definitely under development. At least one city, shout out to Half Moon Bay, has developed a draft of this. It did not make it out of the council, however, but there is a model that could be considered for others that are interested in at least exploring that particular avenue. Next slide. So I want to actually, maybe we should actually go back to the last slide and offer a moment for questions. I see there's been lots of chat activity that I've been ignoring entirely before I talk about exemptions and waivers. Anyone have any clarifying questions we should discuss?
I think most of what's in the chat has been related to affordable housing and whether all electric construction requirements are a burden for affordable housing or not. And so there's, Amy, I don't know if you want to speak to that at all.
I really want to read the chat now. It's a juicy content over there.
I think it is mostly about new construction, new affordable housing. So it really kind of relates a little back previously, but yes, there's been quite a discussion, and I think to summarize, there was the question about the San Jose ordinance and whether there was an exemption for affordable housing, and a couple folks have pointed out that it actually may be more affordable to build all electric construction because you don't have to run the gas infrastructure to a new affordable building if it's all electric. And so, and there's a discussion of, cities who have made exemptions for affordable housing in the past, whether that's something they should continue. So generally a request for information related to that. So that's my high level summary of it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I will chime in if I may. I have seen, and I'm not a developer, but talking with a lot of developers about electrification at large, affordable housing developers seem to be actually the leaders in this space for a lot of reasons, partly because, as you said, it does have cost savings on a by unit basis for the most part, and also because some of the financing and funding for affordable housing actually is tied to their overall emissions, and they can get access to more capital by going all electric. So that they are, when it comes to multifamily, affordable multifamily is absolutely the leadership standard for electrification. So I haven't seen any challenges around that, with the potential exception. I will say that there are some caveats, as always, and I'm sure Misty could speak to this as well. The one challenge is there's specific applications of high-rise water heating where design changes are needed to make a heat pump water heater work. And the technologies, while continuing to emerge and evolve, are not necessarily in the hands of all of the designers yet of understanding how best to overcome that. So it almost universally can be done, from what I understand. However, not all designers know how, if that makes sense. Misty, did you want to weigh in on that at all?
But sure, I agree with you, and I've heard the same thing. I think that it's very important that the designers consider it up front too, because there are some considerations about how much room the different systems take up and where to place them. And so that's something to make sure that the designers are informed from the beginning, because later on it can be a little bit more challenging.
Yeah, great, thank you. So that actually is a really nice segue to talk about exemptions and waivers. What I wanted to do is just briefly talk a little bit about the history. Folks were asking about San Jose in particular and about specific building types. And exemptions are not uncommon for any kind of reach code. And I would be shocked if existing building ordinances don't take good use of them to some extent in the beginning. And they can be designed to be specific to those building occupancies or specific to an appliance. But then we also see them relate to trigger points in terms of like how much of a addition or how much of a remodeling project might be triggering that. And what we have seen with regard to electrification, at least, is that in 2019, a lot of the new construction reach codes had more exemptions, especially around things like laboratories and research and development kind of facilities and commercial cooking. And a lot of those exemptions actually have started to evolve out of the newer adoption of the ordinances. What we're seeing is that when we talk with these folks, some of the cities were just nervous and didn't have the opportunity as they were going through the process to have really complete conversations with the folks operating laboratory buildings in particular, and largely learned that they actually didn't have barriers to all electric, and so did away with those exemptions over time. We often see cities when they're first adopting either use blanket exceptions or have time expired exemptions as well. So if there's an industry that they didn't feel like they connected well with during their outreach process, they might build in you have a 6-month period to engage, and then we can, if we haven't heard from you, we'll go forth and go for all electric, but have that kind of check-in cycle to make sure that they're doing their due diligence. So that's not uncommon, but also using that same kind of mechanism to allow for those unique occupancies to think through what and do some research of their own. So for example, the San Francisco ordinance utilized an exemption with an expiration date for commercial restaurant facilities, commercial cooking facilities, so that they would have time to understand that the opportunities for making those changes and new construction, and so that there would be kind of a nod to just the challenge of restaurateurs over the last 2 years period. So that was the intent behind it. For the most part, though, we're seeing fewer and fewer occupancy specific exemptions as more cities adopt. In fact, most cities that have adopted in the last year have moved to a waiver process instead that would enable the fast moving changes that are happening in manufacturing to be recognized over the 3-year code cycle without there being a burden on staff for doing so. So these are typically done through a onus on the applicant process where they have to show either a really significant financial burden, potentially related to a transformer upgrade or something of that nature, where they just in that location don't have the electrical capacity for whatever reason, or more commonly, the claim of technical infeasibility that then their design team has to prove. And that allows for, if there is in fact a challenge, which again, we have encountered very few, but if there in fact is a challenge, it gives the applicant the opportunity to just state their case. So I want to open up, I'm sure there's people on the phone that have questions about this as well. And most of what I'm discussing is waivers around electrification, although I suspect there's similar questions when it comes to electric vehicles and other types of REACH codes. So are there any specific questions about exemptions waivers that folks would like to ask?
Amy, this is Misty. There was a question in the chat about whether or not there are any cities that actually rolled back exemptions for lab facilities. And I'm not aware of any. I just know that there were fewer and fewer that included them as time went by. But are you aware of any that actually adopted and then rolled the requirement back?
There was at least one, and I'm going to blank on who it was. Let me see if I have it in my notes. But so yes, the answer is yes. If I recall correctly, there was at least one that decided that they would just do away with that process. Very few cities go through what San Jose did and in the same code cycle re-up, but it doesn't mean it doesn't happen. So there, I expect that most of the cities that are readopting now will eliminate those waivers, or those exemptions rather.
Yeah, that was just noted in the chat as well, that many cities are considering which exemptions to begin eliminating now.
Great.
Fabulous.
Great. Any other questions about this?
I believe we've answered all the questions in the chat.
Okay.
So I think
Great.
we're current there. So you don't have to try scanning through there if you're trying to do that.
I am. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. The one thing I will just add is that by far the most common exemption I see is I have seen in the California as well as other outside of California local government adoptions is related to projects that are doing, for example, an attached ADU or some sort of percent of remodel where they're really not even touching the systems we're talking about. So that's the one place where exemptions really are helpful. They're hard to write clearly in terms of percentage of remodel and making sure that they're accurate and consistent. And I would just encourage folks to work with your building department to use some other trigger that you've already defined, whether that's fire code or something of that nature, and just follow that rule rather than trying to create a new one.
Good advice all around. If you have rules already in place, keeping this ordinance consistent with them makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and doing so, separately and not even like discussing it in your adoption process will make your life easier. But that's almost that's more of an annoying aside, I think, than anything. All right, great. We can go ahead. I think that's pretty much the end of my presentation. Do I get to hand it back over to go to the next slide there, Karen? Oh, no, before I do that, let's talk. I apologize. I was going to just leave you without this. So I mentioned briefly regional approaches, and I want you to be aware that this is occurring. So the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, which is one of 9 different air quality management agencies across the state, is working on a rule change it's currently proposed. It's not yet finalized, that would start to make existing buildings kind of a whole new thing. So they're actually looking to regulate the nitrogen oxide emissions of both water heating and space conditioning equipment. And because that, even though we might be burning that indoors, it does affect our outdoor air quality. So so that is something that they're experimenting with right now. It is proposed to move forward. And as you can see here, assuming they do adopt this would, in the Bay Area, stop selling gas appliances, gas water heaters by 2027. Just stop the sale entirely. And then the same for heating and cooling equipment by 2029. So that's something that is at play. If you're not in the BACMA territory, these conversations are happening in other jurisdictions as well. This one is the furthest along. But I do want you to be aware of this, because the elected officials that represent your jurisdictions often are assigned to working on your air quality management districts as well as a representative there. They're the liaisons that make the decisions at that level. And so these conversations sometimes might roll back to you. And so it's important for you just to be aware that this is moving separately, and importantly, statewide, that California Air Resources Board is looking at similar regulations that would evolve to have specific appliance sales limitations sometime in the next decade. So all of that is moving and continuing to evolve, but it's active conversations. I want you to be aware that that's occurring, and maybe that makes it easier for local governments to deal with existing buildings, but it certainly makes it more consistent across the board if in fact these things come forward. In addition to that, there is one specific piece around the CEQA guidelines around all electric construction that has just been approved by BACMA again. So in the Bay Area, there are new CEQA regulations or guidelines to help you support decisions, even if you don't have a REACH code for promoting all electric. So those are there's lots of moving parts, but it's good to know what tools are in your toolbox. At least I hope so. All right.
Thank you very much. We are approaching the end of our hour and a half here. So if there's any quick questions, we can take one last question before we wrap up.
Do you see a couple in the chat?
Okay.
Let's see, Joe McCluskey had one, says part 6 of the Energy Code, section 100.0 for scoping does not include the L occupancy. We had an applicant note that since we adopted the REACH codes under part 6, that the gas ban is not relevant.
Okay.
So
that is good to know, and probably not the direction that anybody will be heading this cycle if it's a gas ban. So apologies for any hassle you might have had there, Joe, and thanks for letting the rest of us know about that.
Yeah.
Okay, and there's
a question
couple others.
Serena Pelka, I'm not sure, Serena, if you want to add some more to this, but she's asking what are some other areas where this is in progress? I'm not sure what you're referring to there. Do you want to clarify?
If by REACH codes or gas ban kind of ordinances, if that's what you're meaning, there are several other cities working on it outside the state as well. Colorado, New York. There are a lot of cities that are pursuing different versions of REACH codes. Not exactly the same as California, I know that.
I suspect the question might be about regional air quality management. I'm not positive, but if it is, I know that South Coast has a low NOx standard that is already in existence, and as far as I understand, there have been discussions about at what point that goes to a 0 NOx standard, and Sacramento is looking to establish something, but they haven't proposed what that is yet. So those are the 2 other air quality management districts that I'm aware of.
Thank you, Amy, and that was correct as far as the reference. Okay. One last question from Christine. Is there an effort to inventory electrical infrastructure, for example, knob and tube, service panel capacity, and others to understand the financial impact of existing building REACH codes on fixed or low income housing stock? The only effort I know of is through the Home Energy Score program that Stop Waste and BayREN are running. You have the electrification checklist, I know. I don't know of any other efforts does anyone else?
I don't know of one that's a comprehensive actual investigation. There are certainly inferences that are being made at a jurisdiction level for those who are undertaking this more of a building stock inventory, but it is making assumptions based on the age and the permit records that are on hand rather than going into actually counting. But it's certainly a valid question, especially with regard to the service panel capacity and some of these older jurisdictions. That being said, I would also argue that the discussion from an electrician's perspective that every building needs a 200 amp panel is being proven incorrect by many contractors out there. And so there remains to be seen what the definitive you must have minimum standard actually is. So all fair questions and a dynamic problem.
Indeed, and a learning process for us all, I think. Okay, fabulous. We are nearing the end of our time, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap those up. We will try to answer any remaining questions in when we send out the materials. But I want to thank our featured speakers today, Amy Ryder and Lawrence Garber of the Building Decarb Coalition. We're just thrilled that you guys could join us to provide your perspectives for this session. Thank you again. And on behalf of all of our co-sponsors, I want to express my gratitude to all of you for attending. And also most especially to those who spoke up early on to ask for assistance. We were very surprised by the level of interest in these sessions, and it turns out it was based on the attendance. It was one of those classic cases of the whole class having the same question, but only a couple people being brave enough to speak up. So to those of you that did, thank you, kudos. Really appreciate it. So we're not at the end of the series. As Karen mentioned, we still have one more webinar in September, but we are going to have a little bit of a break until then. And by that time, a lot of you will be most of the way through the adoption process. So we really hope these webinars are helpful to you as you begin. And just want to remind you that we are all available to support you as you begin moving through the process. And so I encourage you to reach out to us. We all offer slightly different things, but we're all very well connected. And so we work together. And if one of us can't help you, there's a good chance someone else can. So our last webinar in this series is in September 27th. But there are a couple of events coming up in the next month or so. There are 2 Reach Codes webinars on the 2022 new construction studies coming up, and I will drop those links here in the chat. And the BayREN Forum will be coming up in June, and that is on housing and energy, as Karen mentioned. So many different resources still coming your way. So thanks again, and I'm going to hand this off to Lawrence to wrap things up for us today. Lawrence, go ahead and take it away for us.
Thanks, Misty, and thanks all. I just wanted to, as we close, echo the kudos that Misty mentioned, and just highlight the relationship between local governments and broader state and federal policy, and just to say that the Energy Commission has recognized and continues to recognize the role that local governments play in the process. You all are a valuable piece in testing market readiness for new technologies and regulations, driving innovation for new technology and efficiency, bringing down costs, and encouraging manufacturing at scale. So we just wanted to say thank you to you all for your continued leadership in this space, and we look forward to working together. So take care all. Have a great rest of your week.
Thank you, Lawrence, and Karen, Amy, thanks all. Thank you to everyone who attended.
Thank you. And we will send out the materials within the next few days to next week. And we will include a link to the CEQA. Folks were asking for that, so we'll include that link when we send it out. So thank you all, and thanks for all of the help putting in the links in the chat. That was great. It's wonderful to group source some of this, so much appreciated.
Yes, indeed. Thank you.
Yeah, terrific.